Hello and welcome F5 community to This Month in Security. I'm your host, Aubrey King. And joining me this month, I've got Aaron Brailsford.
And don't get me wrong, I love a CTF as much as anybody. I thoroughly enjoy those.
Malcolm Heath.
Don't think that you're going to do the same thing forever, because you're not. Like, the pace of change is way too fast.
And our special guest, Akira Brand from Application Security Weekly podcast.
And I became almost an AppSec evangelist of how to use things like DAS tools, how to use things like SaaS tools, do things like threat modeling, things of this nature.
Strap on those earbuds and get ready for This Month in Security.
Thank you, F5 community, for joining us today. Really quick before we get going, I guess, Akira, if you could kind of, I think our community is already pretty familiar with Aaron. He and I pal around a lot together, and then Malcolm also has been on the show a couple of times. So, Akira, if you give the community a little bit about yourself before we kind of kick into a more in-depth interview, I guess.
Sure. Hi, everyone in the community. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Akira Brand. I currently work as an application security engineer at a company called Brasilia, which is a for-profit that is in the business of helping nonprofits thrive. So it's a very cool place to work. I also am a co-host of a security podcast called Application Security Weekly. And in my free time, I sing opera.
Awesome. So, App Security Weekly, this is a funny one. I think face-to-face, I first met you at RSA, Black Hat last year. Black Hat,
yes.
It was Black Hat, and then we did a webinar together. But funny enough, and for you community members, for whatever reason, did not put two and two together that I was already listening to Akira. And we'd been through the webinar when, by the end of that, I think Akira said something about, yada, yada, and the podcast. And I went, oh my God. I mean, it just was like, a light went out of my head, and I realized, oh, this is the same person I'm listening to already. Is like, working with people like Aaron and Malcolm, I have to get my, all of my data in, and App Security Weekly is a really fantastic podcast for that. Plus, I mean, that the timeliness of, all the news, it's spectacular. And the fact that you guys delve into some other topics, that involve things like DevOps stuff recently, which I've found pretty fascinating. I think we know that the fields are really merging, and that modern security practice has to include that DevOps bit. But I figured maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got involved with AppSec Weekly and how that's going, and I don't know, maybe any other ideas you see coming for that show. Go forward.
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying it's going great. My colleagues are fantastic there. It's a really good show, I think, objectively. Of course, I'm quite biased, and maybe I can't be as objective as I want to be, but I think objectively it's a really good show. So definitely check it out. We do interviews every week, and then we have a little segment for the news right after that. Almost by, like most things in my career, kind of by accident. I applied to be a guest on their show because I just really liked their show and I wanted to guest on it. And the producers emailed me one day and said, hey, we had a guest cancel tomorrow. Can you show up tomorrow? I said, yeah, let's totally do this thing. So I showed up, I gave an interview, and apparently they really liked me because afterward they sent me an email saying, would you like to be a co-host? I was really surprised. I didn't know a lot about the people running the podcast. Like I said, I'd admired it for a while, but I hadn't really interacted with anybody on the staff or anything. So I was very surprised, but of course I jumped at the opportunity just because it's a great way to meet people in the industry. It's a really good way to keep abreast of industry news, especially when you're the one reporting on it. So I said, absolutely, let's do this. And I've been doing it for 5 months now.
Nice. Yeah, that's you. So you must have started kind of around the same exact time as I began this job. I mean, it was neat. I came over from being an SE here and kind of selling the solutions that our company offers. But I don't know, there was more fulfillment to be had, I guess, and some other things that I guess I wanted to get done. So that's another part of the reason why I wanted to have you on the show. One of the things that I find really interesting is the kind of the career path that I've watched you take. In the short time that I've known you, it's like, holy cow, putting some skills together in very different ways. So I guess if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, you said kind of things sort of just happen. I feel kind of the same way, things have sort of fallen into my lap, and I would just love to hear your take on that. And I know there are a lot of community members that are interested in a career now, right? And where to go next. So
yeah, for sure. I guess the thing I want everyone to take away from this story is that it's a really good idea to follow your interests and see where they go until you feel comfortable in one particular area, because that is exactly what I did. And I feel like I made it to where I was supposed to be, but it took me a while. So I'm definitely not a typical graduate from college with a degree, do the same thing for 20, 30 years, and then retire when I'm, 65, 70 years old. That's not anything what my life has looked like, and it's not going to be what my life looks like going forward, I'm sure. I started my career getting a degree from a conservatory at the University of Denver in opera performance. So I'm a trained opera singer. I did a lot of things in that world. I was a singer, I was a conductor, I was a stage director. When I was in arts nonprofit leadership, I was in a leadership position in an arts nonprofit as well. And I did that over the course of 10 years. During that time, I also did a brief stint in seminary. The reason being is when I was quite young, my mother passed away, and that had me start asking a lot of big questions, right? Like, why am I here? Like, what is my purpose in life? How can I help other people? That became really important to me. And at the time, being in a music career was fulfilling personally, but I felt like I wasn't really helping the amount of people I wanted to help. So I decided to go to seminary and check out maybe getting a degree in something like counseling so that I could start to have a little bit more of a hands-on experience with just helping people in a more concrete fashion. When I was in seminary, I quickly realized that music actually helps people in a way that I hadn't thought of before. And that the seminary experience in and of itself was absolutely not for me. There is actually a colloquialism that if you go to seminary, it can actually like hurt your faith pretty badly. They can call it cemetery school, as opposed to seminary school. So I started to feel that going that direction of like, wow, like this is not necessarily what's best for me, even though I am learning skills to help others. Like it's coming at a cost of my own personal well-being. So I decided to leave seminary. And I mean, for some people it works out great. It's just, that's just what it was for me. Right. So after that, I kind of went through a little bit of an identity crisis. I returned back to being a musician full time. I taught tons of students music. That was kind of my like hands-on way of making a difference as a music teacher. And I performed quite a lot still. But I still felt like this kind of sense of unfulfillment, like I'm really not helping people in a way that I want to help people, even though music does, of course, help people. It soothes people. It helps them come to realizations of higher truths about themselves. Like that's a pretty divine and pretty cool way of reaching the world. And musicians are broke, right? Like there's just not a lot of money in it, which is fine, right? There's nothing wrong with being broke. But when you get to be a little bit older and you're not in your early 20s anymore, it's like less romantic to be a starving artist, right? So I started looking for a different career entirely. I was like, I got to get out of music entirely. Like I need to make a change that is more permanent, that also will let me like pay my rent, and eat food, which is always a nice luxury to have, especially in this day and age. So an ex-boyfriend actually suggested I look into programming. And I gave him the stink eye at the time. I said, programming? Like, you mean with computers? Ew. I don't do computers. I was fun at you guys. Like, I didn't own a computer. Everything I did with music was like printed. I still use only printed music. People use iPads now. And I'm like, no, I don't do that. I use printed sheet music. I owned a phone. Everyone had the new iPhones and everyone's like, wow, like look at this touch screen, all this cool stuff. And I was like, no, I have an old Razor flip phone and that is what I use. And I will die using that flip phone. And Actually, for most of my adult life, still have used a flip phone. So yes, if that was your question, yes.
Yeah, it was security by obscurity, I think, is the.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sketchy stuff. So I think through the process of ironically distrusting computers landed me eventually in cybersecurity. Because there's just a little bit of a hint of paranoia, I think, that comes along with this particular segment of the industry. But anyway, I'll make this last section a little bit short because this is like where I got a little crazy. So I started out for code school, and when I left the code school, I realized I didn't really want to be a programmer full time. I wanted to pull on my music background. I wanted to pull on my background of learning how to be essentially a counselor. I wanted to pull on my background of being a teacher and a communicator. And a mentor at the time said, oh, you should look into this new field. It's called DevRel. And I was like, well, what's DevRel? DevRel essentially is the synthesis of every single thing I had done up to that point. Essentially, it stands for developer relations. So you work for a company as sort of an ambassador for a product to software developers or to whatever segment of the population that company is looking to serve and bring their offerings to. So you're not necessarily sitting in a room programming. You might write some code. You might write things like demos and things of this nature, but you're not going to necessarily be a programmer full time. So I did that for a few years and I had a great time. I really enjoyed it. And I ended up working for security companies as a developer relations professional. So through the process of working at these security companies, I learned, of course, more and more about security. And at my most recent job, I worked under a person who's a pretty big name in the AppSec industry. Her name is Tanya Janka. She was my boss. And through working with her, I learned a lot about AppSec in general. And I became almost an AppSec evangelist of how to use things like DAS tools, how to use things like SaaS tools, do things like threat modeling, things of this nature. And I realized, wow, I really want to do this. I didn't want to write software necessarily, but I really want to do AppSec engineering. And I know enough about software that I can feel my way around a code base, things of this nature. But it was it seemed like a good fit, right? And so I applied for some AppSec engineering jobs and I got one. I'm in my first AppSec engineering role. I've been in it for 5 weeks. So you can say I'm a bit of an expert. Get right. I will. But yeah, and it's going great. Like, it's going awesome. I love doing what I'm doing. Also, the company I work for supports nonprofits. So that's a really long-winded story. But at the end of the day, I feel like it finally came full circle for me, right? It took from the time of my mother passing away and me starting to ask all these big questions about life and like wanting to make a bigger difference to actually having a job where first I'm fulfilled, where I could pay rent, and like I'm actually making this difference for other people. It took me 8.5 years, but it was so worth it. It was totally worth it. And I just kept my eyes open and kept my ear to the ground and tried to stay true to myself and tried new things. And here I am.
That's awesome. It's funny because for me, sort of similar, had the musician thing going, really had I don't trust computers at all. I mean, really honestly, and I'm sorry, Malcolm and Aaron, but by Windows wise, right? I was a Windows 3.1. I ran it in DOS. I think you guys know I'm a Linux heart. But I did everything that I could to stay away from Windows 95. I'd never used Windows 95 by like 1998. So 98 was already out. I never even touched 95 just because I thought it was the devil. And I'm going to say it like that. I thought computing was like, that's the end of, human interaction and blah, blah, blah. As I watch my kids though, right? Look at your kids. So, but you have to embrace it. Like you said, you do have to eat. It's fun to pay the rent. And that thing has never paid me much until I had to, that thing being my guitar. But until I had to write a theme song for a podcast, right? So DevRel is really kind of, it sort of can, like you said, encompass all of those things.
If I may, I loved what you said about following your interests. I was just talking about this with somebody last night. My whole career has been essentially just following my nose wherever it led me. And I've been super, super lucky to be able to actually remain employed while doing that. I started off doing technical support for an ISP, learning something about networking, and then doing system administration and network administration, and eventually ending up doing security administration, and then doing cert work with Aaron, and now I'm doing research. And it's what's kept things fresh for me, because after a while, 2, 3, 4 years being super specific and very, very focused on one thing, I typically get, it sounds terrible to say, but I get a little bored often, right? You kind of, after like 3 or 4 years, you kind of get your hands around the job that you're doing, and you're doing it well. And you can do that for a year or two, at least for me. But then I start to want to do the new thing. And I've been able to switch careers within the career a whole bunch of times. So I'm really, really happy it worked out for you. Like, it's nice to hear somebody else, because I think an awful lot of the time people come into the career thinking, I'm going to do this one thing. And while being focused on getting your first gig by being really good at one thing is probably not a bad idea. At least for me, you're not going to have a whole career doing that, right? You're going to have a whole bunch of mini careers through the industry. If you remain excited and activated about, whatever it is you happen to be kind of obsessing about at the moment.
I think that's true. Like, at least for me, one thing I will say is that now I don't dislike computers. I actually really like computers now. And being able to be flexible, essentially, Malcolm, I think is what you're pointing to, is like follow your nose and be flexible, be willing to become obsessed with something. Right. And I remember when I was in conservatory, they actually told us that. They said, now is the time to become obsessed.
Yeah.
And at the time, of course, they were referring to music. But when I went to code school, I reported the same thing. I was like, now is the time in my life to become obsessed again. And over the past 4 years, I've become obsessed with so many different aspects of technology that it's really fun. I think it's led me more to becoming more of a generalist than a specialist, of course, but that may change, right? Right now, I'm really obsessed with AppSec, and I have a really great opportunity to, get my hands dirty, get my feet wet in that industry. And we'll see where it takes me. So I'm curious to all of you. There's an ongoing debate that I hear a lot of, like, which one is better? Is it better to be a generalist, or is it better to be a specialist?
I have a giant rant on this. So yeah, Aaron, please go ahead.
I'm of the opinion that it's good to start out as a generalist, or at least, so my career progression, I guess, a little bit like Malcolm's. Started out in support. I did some time in development. I, followed my nose. I bounced around, and I learned a bunch of things, like, on a wide range of topics. And some of the best specialists I've known have had like a broad base of experience. They didn't start out going, I'm going to do reverse engineering malware. That's all I'm ever going to do in my career. They did a bunch of things. Probably spent some time as a developer, and they moved around, learn all of the sides of the technology. So all of the ends, right? So from the user end to the development end, and then apply that to their specialism. That's my take anyway. It's really hard to, I'm sort of drifting a little bit, but people will ask, like, how do I get into information security? How do I get a job in security? It's a really hard thing to answer. Security is so broad. IT, like computing, is so broad. How do I tell you how to get a job in security when security is just such a vast topic, right? You kind of need to, I think, feel your way around a bit, like you say, and then figure out what it is that you actually enjoy and which bit of that thing you want to specialize in. And if you do that, then by definition, you're going to end up as a bit of a generalist to begin with, because you've probably sniffed around a whole bunch of stuff before you ever narrowed in. That's That's my hot take on that anyway. What's your rant, Malcolm?
Okay, hang on. No. I mean, honestly, it's much the same. I think that it's a really, really difficult and interesting question, because these days, as opposed to when, say, Aaron and I got into the industry, when I got into the industry, IT in general, if you had a pulse and a working right hand, you could get a job. I mean, it was not hard to break in. It would be doing tech support. It would be doing, kind of grunt work. But, and I say that without any negative connotations. I did support for years, and in many ways, it's a fantastic job, and I learned tons. But having said that, these days, a lot of companies want to hire people who are more specialized than they did back in the day. That is a difficult choice, because you might very well feel like you have to specialize, and that isn't necessarily what maybe you want to do, or it can lead to burnout. I think generalists overall, over the course of an entire career, will probably do better than somebody who's hyper-focused for a number of reasons, not the least of which is if you, for example, specialized in a particular technology or part of the field that, due to economic reasons, just sort of disappears, then you're kind of out of luck, right? I knew people who were going to code school to try to become developers because their job being mainframe administrators went away, right? I think being a generalist gives you more flexibility over the course of your career, but it's also hard to get hired as a generalist. So it's a little bit of a conflict there. Having said that, I think the one thing that I would really want to say is, right now I see a ton of people who are trying to break into security who are really, really focused on becoming red teamers or pen testers. And in some ways, I totally get that, because that stuff's cool. That's where you would have edited out a swear word, Aubrey, by the way. This stuff is super cool. It really is. And it's really exciting. But there's also, like, that's where everybody is pointing right now. So there's a lot of competition. There's also a lot of training material online for that stuff. And I think that's wonderful. I kind of want to suggest that people look at blue team defense stuff, because that stuff is just as cool, uses exactly the same skill set, but people aren't necessarily applying for it, right? And there's tons of jobs. It probably doesn't really matter what you end up coming into the field on, but don't think that you're going to do the same thing forever, because you're not. Like, the pace of change is way too fast.
Ask any COBOL programmer, right, about the pace of change.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a few of those knocking around still, but not many.
One or two of those guys, they're still there.
Yeah, they'll still be there in central banking, that kind of thing. That's still rolling around on mainframe architecture.
Government.
Yeah. You say about red teaming, Malcolm, that's an interesting point. It is, well, here's my impression of red teaming that everybody wants to get into. It's very cool. It's very whizzy. When you're doing the training courses and the CTFs, and don't get me wrong, I love a CTF as much as anybody. I thoroughly enjoy those. But if you speak to people who have got into, like, red teaming, which generally means pen testing, right? At least at the entry level, it's a lot of following the same playbook every time you do an engagement. And it's more about report writing than it is about, like, you aren't going out finding brand new 0 days to, like, break into someone's infrastructure. You follow the playbook that you're given to pen test every organization based on, what they have deployed, and then you write the report. And it's, over and over again. Whereas I think blue teaming probably has more variety in it. It's a lot of the same skills, but you're always defending against new and different threats.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the work that you and I did on the F5 cert, we got to see so many different things that customers were bringing to us, right, all the time. And I thought that was fantastic. I learned a whole lot because some customer would call up and be like, "We're under attack," and it turned out it was an attack that I had never seen before. That was fascinating and super useful to expanding my knowledge of different things. So, yeah.
It's an awesome discussion, but I did want to add real quick. For me, I felt much the same for the most part. I feel that breadth is imperative, and then you can kind of specialize later on. However, I'm going to be Debbie Downer here for a second and say, I fear that we could see the end of generalism because of ChatGPT. Dun, dun, dun. But that's it. Like the more and more I see people go to ChatGPT and go, "Hey, write me an I rule that does XYZ." Boom, it's there. Or give me an exploit against CVE, blah, blah, blah. How? Really, we're seeing these things happen already. So I do have some fear there. And one thing about blue teaming, I will say, one of the most fun challenges I ever had to solve was blue teaming. Authentication issues with SAML, right? That's a fun one to resolve. And you have to base 64 decode absolutely everything and then sniff once inside of it and then craft your solution. So that kind of creativity, is not something that I have had, to you guys' points, with red teaming as much. Following that playbook can get old. I love Dawson, a customer when they ask me to as much as the next person does, but but it's not as fulfilling, I think, as getting that unknown and then resolving it.
One last thought about that generalism thing. I think what might spell the end of generalists is less the automated tooling. Like ChatGPT is awesome and terrifying and wrong sometimes in equal measures. But if you stack up IT as a pyramid of knowledge, right, and you've got the general at the bottom, that bottom is getting wider all the time. At some point, it's going to be so wide that you just can't cover that whole spectrum of knowledge. And people will come into the industry naturally with just a part of that pyramid. Like, for people like Malcolm and I, who've been doing this for a long time, when we started, the bottom of that pyramid was a lot narrower. Or at least I feel like it was a lot narrower.
Yeah.
And it was easier to cover the whole spectrum of that. I said something on Twitter the other day. I love reverse engineering of hardware. And there's a chap I follow who does a lot of reverse engineering and deconstructing of processors. And he had, I think it was the 8080. Yeah, I think it was the Intel 8080. And was talking about that. And I said, like, I feel lucky to have come into IT back when it was 8 and 16-bit micros. Right? So I could learn Z80 assembler, 6502 assembler. It was simple instruction sets and then build from there. I didn't have to come in learning x86 64-bit assembler, or ARM7. It was a much smaller pyramid. I think. Anyway.
Yeah.
A lot of people now do never have that opportunity to even go that low. You know what I mean? We have all these high level languages now. You can have an entire career at Python and never go any lower than that. And I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but one thing I'm always trying to learn is I'm trying to learn more about computer science. Every chance I get, I'm teach me about assembly, teach me about ARM architecture. I want to know what is going on in the bare metal, because I'm just super nerdy like that, right? I took an electrical engineering class once and I was like, let's do circuits, man. Let's do this thing. But most people don't have that opportunity anymore unless they really seek it out, or they pay a ton of money to get a computer science degree later on in life. Yeah. Which is, I think it's a bummer.
Those are super good points. I think I was actually just thinking about this the other day. The reason why I ended up in security was because of exactly what you just said, Akira. I want to know how it works under the hood. And security offered me the opportunity to peel back all the layers. Because so much of the time, vulnerabilities exist in the bit between what actually happens and what the developer is assuming will happen, or what the abstraction layer obscures, if you will, right? So that's exactly why I ended up going into security, because it was like, oh, I want to know how processors work. Studying shellcode and, you know, various binary exploitation techniques is a great way to learn about that, right?
Yes.
And it just so happens that it ends up being useful in some other ways too. But to Aaron's point, I think that you're absolutely right. It's getting wider all the time. There's one thing that actually kind of bugs me, if I can get up on my soapbox a little bit. I've been doing a bunch of reviews, not like public, but like reviewing various IT security training courses, and so many of them have the one module about subnetting, and I'm surprised that all of them have that, because honestly, in my opinion, that is a bit of training that you need to pass an interview that you will not use in the rest of your career. And so I want to just challenge everybody to think about what you're asking during your interviews, whether or not that's actually relevant to the role, because demanding that an entry-level person know about subnet masks may not actually be a great question. Like, maybe you should ask them about application security relevant topics or something like that, right? Okay. I'm stepping down off my soapbox now, but yeah.
Well, I think we probably have to move forward. Wow, that was a neat kind of surprise. We ended up talking a little bit more about that stuff. Which great question, Akira.
Yeah, right. That's why they pay me the $medium.
What was that?
Why they pay me the medium dollars.
The medium dollar.
Love those medium dollars.
Medium bucks is good. Well, I guess we'll probably shift into another piece of interesting discussion that we've had, throughout the past many months, and that is LastPass continues, right? I think as a piece of news, Aaron and Malcolm and I, it seems like we've been talking about this for months and months and months, as is everybody. But just when you think it's over, it continues again and again and again and again. So just to find, what I'm speaking about here, it would appear that we very recently had an employee's computer breached, which ended up loosing quite a bit more out onto the open internet. I know, Aaron, you had some thoughts on this one. Any you care to elaborate a bit?
Yeah.
On where does this end?
Where does it end? I mean, it's this LastPass are not in a good place right now. And again, I will try not to throw too much shade in their direction, but this is the second time that an attacker used the soft fleshy thing, the person, as a route to get at the data that they wanted. Right, the first breach was a person who was phished for their credentials, if memory serves. This second breach is a person who had... So the way I read this, either LastPass use a bring your own device model, or they have very few restrictions on what you can install on your corporate machine, right? Or they let you attach to the corporate network from a private machine, which is essentially bring your own device again. And this particular user had a piece of software installed for watching media, and they allegedly used a remote code execution vulnerability in that to get onto that machine. And then they used that machine and that person to get the keys that they needed to be able to decrypt the data that they wanted out, right? I haven't seen any news on whether that RCE is unfixed or whether it's an already patched vulnerability that was, disclosed some while back. And so that user was running an old version. But this, for me, this made me think, right, that bring your own device model always seemed weird to me, right? We did it for phones in F5. We haven't done it for laptops, thankfully. But it just seemed like you were giving up control of, the thing that would give an attacker access to all of your corporate secrets. But it's just, you're trading off capital outlay on assets for a supportability and security nightmare further down the line. And the other thing it made me think was, endpoint detection, actually noticing something going wrong on an endpoint is really, really, really hard. There are tons and tons of tools out there and tons of reporting you can put in place, but it's still remarkably easy to sail straight past them. I saw some research definitely last month at this point, about writing an exploit in Rust, I think it was written in. And writing it in Rust, they used no obfuscation techniques, no fancy trickery, just, direct calls to stuff that the endpoint protection software should pick up and would pick up if the same thing was done in C, and it saw nothing. Mm-hmm. Like, it's still incredibly easy, obnoxiously easy to just waltz straight past this stuff, which brings me back to surely bring your own devices, just insanity.
Yeah, it's hard. There are situations when you kind of need to, especially when you're highly specialized. But I agree with you. And it's funny. I griped about the fact that just before we started recording this, I sent a link in chat that was all proxied out by some Microsoft stuff, because I, in fact, have to use for a production machine occasionally, a machine that is, mine. But it when you do corporate stuff on it, at least, it becomes almost unusable. And while that is really a pain in the butt, watching breaches like this make me real comfortable in the fact that we do lock things down super hard if an employee wants to use, their device, at least here. I wish more companies would be about that as well.
I gotta say that the first thing that went through my mind when I was reading about LastPass was, well, besides the fact that the way that they did it, the way that the attacker got in was kind of interesting. I mean, props. Like, that was actually not bad. But that the way that you defend against that kind of thing is by having an architecture that is resilient to that. And that's where I'm the most concerned about LastPass, was the amount of data that was not encrypted, that was subject, like, not encrypted enough, because they got a master key, they were able to access all this stuff, but at some point the encryption of the data needs to be at the level where even an admin can't see it. Mm-hmm. Right? That's a resilient architecture for this kind of use case, and it wasn't present, and that really hit hard, I think, for me. It was like, well, okay, like, we've had this idea of assume breach. We know how to do these things. Like, what are the proximate factors that are preventing companies from doing the right thing in these scenarios, and then ending up getting into these sort of situations?
My question for you, Malcolm, and Aaron, and Aubrey, for everybody, is like, how do you know when what you've done is enough? Like, Malcolm, you mentioned, like, it wasn't encrypted enough. And
yeah.
Like Aaron mentioned, like, the bring your own device. Like, how do you know when the devices that you are bringing are locked down enough? Like, because there's no like standardization, as far as I know, at least across the industry, that's like, yep, like, you've hit your benchmark. Like, now you can rest a little bit easy.
That's a really, really good question. Because how much is enough, right? I mean, my answer is always going to be more, right? So, in retrospect, it's always got to be more. But at some point, you run into usability, or you run into expense, or just, you could spend all of your company's budget on securing stuff and never actually produce anything. Oh, no, like, so I would say that this is exactly where threat modeling comes in. This is, there is a whole field dedicated to trying to figure out what is enough in the general case. It's not 100%. It's not a guarantee, but applying the limited resources that you have in the right areas to protect you against the most likely scenarios, seems to be the best way that anyone's figured it out so far. I don't know. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, it's one of those things where the benchmark is going to be different for everybody, or for every organization, or even within an organization. If you have a well segmented structure for different parts of your org, there's some stuff that you care less about, simply. And yeah, it's I mean, what stops companies doing the necessary is always money. So yeah, it comes down to, you have to put the money in the right places. It's a really, really difficult problem. They're like, what's the quote about, the only secure computer is one turned off, disconnected, buried in concrete. Like you can never do enough.
Right.
And tossed in the ocean, if I remember correctly. Yeah, that's
And when you look at it, not just from the end user perspective, but also from a server perspective. I came from a long ops career of server administration on the Unix side before ever touching F5. And I got to say, I thought for sure that my double bastion rings and all my routing that protected my servers was going to be, the end all be all. What's a php.ini file? They'd like, you've done enough. Well, I think it goes back to that generalist thing, right? You do have to have a broad understanding, and you do have to have an understanding of technology that you're going to deploy to if you're building servers and services.
It's a never-ending cycle of refinement. It might be the nicest way I can say it, perhaps. When I was first in the career, just like you, Aubrey, it was like we were really, really focused on network security, and we got to the point where probably network security, if you do it according to a number of patterns, you'll have pretty good network security. Well, what did attackers do? They went up the stack, right? It wasn't scanning. It wasn't like exploiting vulnerabilities in I don't know, Finger or some random weird service that you happen to be running on your network, because they couldn't get to that. Well, they then started going up the stack. And now we find that it's all app security, right? Because the network's locked down, the OS is hardened, hopefully. Applications are where it's at. So hopefully, and the weird thing about that is that every time we go up, the attack surface gets broader.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's gonna get harder as we do that, but hopefully we will start maturing app security to the point where we can kind of trust it just the way that we trust network and OS security now, a lot more than we used to back in the day. That's my hope. Anyways, so the work that you're doing, Akira, is you are, in my opinion, in exactly the right spot to be doing great work.
Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, it's gonna take a lot of work. And just to throw this out, I recently did a denial of a DDoS report that's available on f5labs.com. The one of the major things that came out of that was that even in DDoS, which is not tremendously sophisticated stuff, attackers are moving higher up the stack, targeting applications more. And I think it's because the DDoS solutions at the lower layers are getting robust enough that they make it hard to do the thing. So it's a constant struggle to figure out the next thing that you need to secure, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it's funny you bring up the report, Malcolm, because coincidentally, that's something that we wanted to talk to you about today. On the show, that is
almost like I planned it.
almost. That is the new release from Labs. So I guess if you want to kind of talk to the community a little bit about that.
Yeah, we've done a DDoS report for several years running now, and we get data from a part of F5. That does DDoS protection essentially. So it's the part of the F5 distributed cloud thing, and so they provide us with some data of what they're seeing. We were able to analyze about 3 years worth of data in this most recent report, which is interesting because if you do sort of spot sampling, you'll get a picture of what's happening right now, but it's interesting to observe the trends that occur over time. And what we saw was that 3 years ago, the majority of what we were seeing was volumetric attacks, and that's fallen off a great deal. And in fact, the overall peak bandwidth has fallen as well. So, not to say that there aren't threat actors out there who aren't capable of doing multi-terabit attacks, because there are. But in the general case, and this was sort of one of the things that I tried to pull out and feature in the report, is that depending on which type of DDoS attack you're going to see, the amount of bandwidth that you're going to expect to see hitting you falls within pretty standard ranges. And the majority of the attacks by sort of count, if you will, are much lower level than the multi-terabit ones that end up making the news. Honestly, for those, if you don't have some kind of a third-party provider that can scrub that traffic, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to survive it. It just will overwhelm whatever network connection you happen to have, unless you're a company that can pay for a lot of money for very, very large connections. But in the general case, an awful lot of it maybe can be handled. Well, certainly if you're using one of those scrubbing providers, they can handle an awful lot of stuff. I think that might be driving this trend towards using more application layer stuff. If you think about it, it's sort of like if you have a certain amount of force that you can apply, if you want to do damage, do you want to spread the force out across a large area, or do you want to bring it to as small an area as possible? In some ways, attacking an application is more specific, probably a little harder to do, but it can have a much more deleterious effect if done properly. So, and it's harder to defend against because that application is what you want your actual customers to be able to access, right? So discerning what is attack traffic versus what is legitimate traffic becomes harder in that scenario. So I think that's probably the main thrust of the report is look to your applications because attackers certainly are.
Malcolm, how would we find that report? Where is it?
If you go to f5.com/labs, it should be right there, unless it's been replaced by something that one of my coworkers has done.
Well, and I think we're going to be talking to him next month.
Yeah, which I mean, read his stuff too. It's amazing.
So, I guess we will look for more on the report, and of course, we love seeing things come out from labs. So we will include links to everything we've got here. There were a couple of news articles that we didn't get to today. So if you're out there and want to keep up on the latest news, don't forget to check out ESXi ARGs and the CISA response. Important, that's kind of a neat story. ESXi ARGs is a scary one. It could be if you're very into VMware versus KVM. Go Linux. And then the CISA response was really neat. And in addition to that, there has also been a massive GoDaddy breach. So wanted to cover a little bit about that. If you are a GoDaddy customer like myself, you may want to get on the Googles. So thank you, Aaron and Malcolm, for joining me this month. It's been a pleasure as always. And Akira, thank you so much for coming on and talking to the community. It's a pleasure to actually have someone turn it around and bounce some questions off us too. So
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Awesome. We'll be tuning into ASW, I'm sure. And thank you so much, community, for joining us.
Thanks for tuning in to This Month in Security, a DevCentral podcast. I'm Aubrey from DevCentral. Want to thank Malcolm, Aaron, and Akira for joining me this month, and I hope that you, the community, will join me next month and every month by hitting subscribe and liking and spreading the word. Thank you, and as always, have a great F5 day.